Professor Ikenberry. Good afternoon, Professor Ikenberry. I thank you on behalf of all the Diplomacy Festival team for participating in this year's event. So Ikenberry is a theorist of international relations and United States foreign policy. And he's an Albert G. Milbank Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University. He's also a co-director of Princeton Center for International Security Studies and author of 8 books. So today's topic is, will the US and Western democracies build a global infrastructure of multilateral cooperation following the COVID-19 crisis? Following there, Professor Ikenberry's opinion on this topic, we'll be addressing him a few questions asked by the students, and we're giving you the floor, Professor. Thank you beforehand.
Thank you. Great to be here. I look forward to questions from the students. I'll just say that my focus today is really on the Western democracies that were so important after World War II and over the last 70 years in creating a global framework of international cooperation, the so-called multilateral system that has crossed over economic and political and environmental and public health and security realms to create a kind of global system. As we know, that global system is now in very much disrepair. It's not simply the rise of the COVID pandemic or even the failure of the United States, the stepping back of America from its historic role as a kind of patron and leader in promoting multilateral cooperation. It's a deep kind of recession or decline or decay in the broader spirit of multilateral cooperation. And it's something that cuts across so many different realms. You can see this kind of crisis of multilateralism in the response to the pandemic. In the first instance, we have a world that has kind of gone each in its own way, looking for solutions, reinforcing nationalism, reinforcing competition, making US-China relations even more dangerous and conflictual. Perhaps the low point of cooperation, maybe historians will see it this way in future years, was April of 2020 when the so-called G7 countries, the ministers, came together to plan what they would do in the face of the worst public pandemic in 100 years and the worst economic recession in 80 years. And yet these 7 historic democracies could not even agree on a communique of common cause. So there was something quite dysfunctional and worrisome about how our leading democratic states are operating today. This became even more clear when you step back and look at the broader failure of our democratic states to provide leadership in multiple areas of international cooperation. The United States, of course, has been particularly bad in creating leadership, providing leadership. Think about the Trump administration withdrawing from the WTO, withdrawing from arms control agreements, withdrawing from the Paris climate change agreement. So there's just been an extraordinary breakdown of cooperation. And I think we can talk today a little bit about what might happen, whether there's a chance that this decline can be reversed. But I would just simply say that we are facing a crisis, and a crisis of, you might say, crisis manifest in a failure to see how we can benefit ourselves through common cause and common pursuit of collective solutions to our common problems. So that's where we are, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Professor. So I will be starting with the first question. It goes like this. The coronavirus crisis could be a turning point in the history of cooperation international organizations. Speaking about the times of the insurgence of the virus, there are many criticisms on how the World Health Organization operated. Do you believe that these difficulties came from its limits that every international organization faces, or do you think that further integration could have improved the organization capacity in managing the crisis?
Well, I think that the problems are deeper than the WHO. I think the problems are the failure of our leading countries to invest in a collaborative, cooperative international public health concerns, building capabilities, a kind of failure in leading countries like the United States to support expertise and science-based responses to communicable diseases. And as I said earlier, a kind of failure to make the case to our publics that we can't go it alone. That the pandemic is inherently, manifestly a common problem, that we are only as safe in a world of pandemic as the weakest link in the chain. The public health institutions of the weakest, poorest country in the world are a concern for all of us, because the outbreak of disease in one place can easily spread to another place. So the pandemic is, in some sense, the poster child of why we need collaboration, why we need ongoing, permanent, high-level, generously funded, science-backed cooperation. And so all of this is disappointing. As I said, it's not simply a problem of the failure of the international organization, although all of our global institutions require ongoing maintenance from the United Nations on down. International institutions, in some sense, are only as good as the constituents and state patrons that support them. And when states don't fund them, when states don't work together to make sure that those institutions are reformed and updated and given a kind of a set of directions and a vision, then those institutions tend to break down. After all, they're intergovernmental. They're not backed by some kind of world government. It's all backed by governments that, if they aren't working together, can push and pull these institutions in very different directions. And all of this is made worse by the fact that the United States has stepped back from supporting the WHO and supporting multilateral institutions. And China is, to some extent, stepping up, but in a very specific way, with its own interests in mind, not as a kind of liberal international patron. So that creates another level of disagreement and makes it harder for these institutions to be updated and reformed.
Thank you, Professor. I will go on and I'll ask you the second question. One of the main points in Joe Biden's electoral program for the presidential elections is renew American leadership to mobilize global action on global threats. Do you believe that if Biden wins the nomination, the US will make it on time to restore its leadership in the global infrastructure, or could it be too late?
That's a great question, and thank you for asking. I don't think it's too late. I don't think it's ever too late in international relations. We are in a bad situation now, but it's certainly not as bad as it was in the 1930s or during World War II. So we are not at the absolute bottom. There's we can look up and we can see a better world. I do think that the Biden administration, if it's elected, would be a pretty strong advocate of a return of American leadership, obviously in a different world, not in the old way of American dominance, but in a collective, cooperative, coalitional way. And I think candidate Biden, Vice President Biden, has talked about trying to restore a whole set of international institutions that have deteriorated in recent years under the Trump administration, starting with NATO and starting with the alliance system, but returning to a kind of functioning, working relationship with the leading democracies. He has proposed a kind of calling of the democratic partners of the world in the first months of his new administration to bring partners who are, for the most part, like-minded democracies that are having troubles to come together and renew our commitment to building and reforming the international system. It's not that the democracies should push everybody off stage and run the international order themselves, but that the democracies do have a kind of special capacity and a history and a kind of tradition of collaboration that can be very helpful in driving the reform agenda. We're going to have to do a lot of things to at the same time to create a better, more functional system, reforming the trade system and its rules, taking another look at the WTO, working certainly on environmental cooperation, building on the Paris Agreement, and I think a kind of arms control agenda that would engage Russia and China. So I think there is in the experts and former officials who work around or in the Biden orbit, there is a great eagerness to roll up their sleeves and pursue a kind of rebuilding agenda. And so I think that it will only work, I think, if other countries can restore their trust in the United States, if the United States can earn a new cycle of trust with its old partners and with new partners. So let's just put it this way: it won't be easy, but I think we've seen what the alternative is, which is not very pretty. The alternative of American leadership, of liberal democratic leadership, and that fact, the fact that we see the alternative, a kind of Trump world that looks very dangerous, looks very looks very ugly. It makes us all worse off. That kind of sense of, well, let's don't keep doing that. Let's do something different. Let's return to a path that we've been on before that we know works. That kind of spirit, I think, can take us at least some way down this road to rebuilding.
Thank you, Professor Ikenberry. That was a very insightful response. So I'm going to ask you the third question, which is going to be the last question as we have the time limit. So considering how the EU and the single member state managed the pandemic, do you think that there was a shift in the balance of power, and have one more countries gained a homogenic role in EU?
Well, I guess I'll say yes and no. I do think that Germany, looking at Europe from America, Germany under Merkel has looked pretty good, and not just regarding the pandemic, but more generally a kind of sense of responsibility to Europe and to the wider world that has been quite reassuring to those of us in the United States who feel like our own government hasn't been doing very much of that. Obviously, every country in Europe is struggling, as is the United States. Not as much. Europe has done better in the aggregate, certainly after the initial chaos that, as you know, occurred in Italy and then in other parts of Europe. But Germany has seemed to have been a country that is worthy of some respect for how they've dealt with this issue. But I think the way I would answer the question is, yes, there are some individual European countries that have elevated themselves as leaders in this pandemic, starting with Germany. But I think Europe, as a more general confederation of states, looks pretty good as a whole. I think that Europe's place in the world has been strengthened through this pandemic, and its role, hopefully in cooperation with the United States, will harness that energy of Europe. And it's not the Europe of the triumphant march to a kind of European dream. It's not that high-minded vision of European Union. It's more of a world-weary, we can do it, we need each other, kind of pragmatic, sober vision that Europe has to step up and do things in both the European space, but more broadly with engaging United States and China and the rising parts of the world to lay down rules and institutions for the next decade. So I think Europe as a whole has been a kind of winner, so to speak, in this pandemic, and we're wishing them well.
Thank you, Professor. These were all the questions that were asked by the students, and I hope they're going to be satisfied with the answers, as I am. Thank you a lot. Thank you a lot for this productive, let's say, session, and have a nice day.
Thank you. Great to see you. Be well and be safe.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.